Somebody is making a lot of money off of you believing that your job doesn't exist 10 years from now. I want you to sit with that for a second. Not the technology, not the models, not the inference costs. It's the belief narrative that somebody needs you to believe this, and they're spending real capital to make sure you do. Because here's the thing, when I'm working with private businesses, when I'm in the federal agencies, when I'm sitting across from CDOs, CIOs, CXOs, and at enterprises across the world who are trying to figure out what their data actually looks like before they run a single model on it. The picture is not what you're being sold, not even close. So today we're going to trace the money. We're going to talk specifically over why this landscape is developing around these narratives. We're going to look at who's actually saying that work is over, what they own, what they gain from you believing it. And then we're going to look at what the data actually shows happening inside real organizations. This is the Refinery Report, deep dive for 2026, June. If you haven't already liked and subscribed, please go ahead and take a chance. Do that. Go to the link in my bio. Join me on my other platforms as well so you can stay up to date with these articles. Okay, so let's start talking about some of the bigger players here, right? There's three names you need to know if you haven't already become familiar, but Marc Andreessen, Sam Altman, and Peter Thiel. These are not random people. These are three of the most capital heavy voices in technology, and all three of them have said something publicly about AI and the labor that I want to put under a microscope today. Let's start with Andreessen, A16Z Partner, a venture capital firm with something in the range of $35 billion under management. He has been public and loud about dismissing AI job loss fears. You'll find quotes from him in 2025 and 2026 calling the whole narrative fake, essentially moral panic. Then you have Altman, CEO of OpenAI, one of the most visible people in this entire space. He spent years publicly championing universal basic income as the societal safety net of AI displaced workers. And then quietly, he walked that back, replaced it with the concept that is being called token distribution, which is something very different. And we will get into why that matters. Then you have Thiel, Palantir investor, founders fund, slightly different angle. His public position and interviews, including one from Fortune 2024, is that AI is going to erode the value of STEM credentials. A computer science degree is going to be less valuable because the work that computers are doing used to need a scientist, or specifically you, to know how to direct that computer. And now the computer has said that it will be directing itself. These are three completely different angles. But notice what they do share. They're all telling you something very specific about what the labor is worth. See, Marc Andreessen, one of the more public, or I think long-standing figures here, this was where it gets a little bit more interesting because none of these specific people like Marc Andreessen come from a neutral position on this. Andreessen's firm, specifically A16Z, has made substantial bets on AI. They have invested in companies that need the AI narrative to hold, companies whose valuations depend on the market, believing that AI is going to fundamentally organize or reorganize labor. If the market decides this disruption story is overblown, those valuations will compress. So when Andreessen calls AI job loss fears fake, ask yourself, what does that framing do for the companies that he's holding? Altman runs OpenAI, which is currently in the middle of a massive commercial push. Subscriptions, API revenue, enterprise contracts. The more enterprises believe AI is existential necessity, the more they will be spending. The more they spend, the better OpenAI's numbers look. He has a personal equity. The valuation of that company depends on the narrative holding. Now, the universal basic pivot is what I want to spend a second on. Altman used to say AI will displace workers and we'll need universal basic income to make that work for regular people. But that's at least a coherent argument. But the token distribution replacement, he's now suggesting people will receive tokens, essentially units of AI compute. Think about what that means. He's replacing a cash safety net with a stake in AI ecosystem. Who controls that ecosystem? Who sets the rules on how those tokens are worth anything? I'll let you work that one out. Thiel's angle is subtler, but the incentive structure is the same. If STEM credentials erode in value, what rises? Access to the tools and infrastructure that replace those credentials. Who owns that infrastructure? This is not a conspiracy. This is just how incentives work. See, the people who most loudly telling you what your labor is worth have a direct financial interest in that story. Let me just put the paradox on the table again, plainly, before we go to the data here. And if you haven't already checked out that video, I'll put a link in the description as well to this video. But let's talk about some of the opponents of the paradox. Post-labor economics, which I'm sure you may have heard of quite often if you're checking this video out. That's the idea that AI is going to eliminate meaningful human work. It's not a neutral forecast. It is a funded theology or ideology. And the distinction here, I think, matters. A neutral forecast is, here's what the economic data shows. Here's the mechanisms. Here's where the uncertainty lives. A funded theology is, here's the story that benefits specific actors. And those actors are investing in getting you to accept it. That doesn't mean AI isn't changing work, though, right? I want to be specific here. It clearly is. But the shape of that change and how fast, how total, who wins, who loses, that is being actively narrated by people with enormous financial stakes in the answer. A peer-reviewed paper published in March 2025 in PMC, the title being AI Universal Basic Income and Power, Symbolic Violence in the Tech Elite Narrative. That paper made exactly this argument in academic language. The authors call it symbolic violence. The powerful frame, the terms of the future, and everyone else who is left trying to survive inside that frame. I'm not here to sell you a different ideology. I'm here to show you what the numbers look like when you get inside actual organizations. Again, my perspective being built from a practitioner and a senior manager throughout the data landscape, cybersecurity landscape. So stat one here for you is that 95% of generative AI deployments have zero measurable P&L impact, according to the MIT Project MANDA. Stat two for you, 73% of enterprise AI deployments are failing to achieve projected ROI or return on investment, according to a McKinsey Global AI Survey of 2026. I'll put the link in the description for that as well. Stat three, $665 billion in enterprise AI spending, majority of that underperforming, according to AI Governance Today, another 2026 publication. Okay, so here we want to go into the data, and I want to be really precise here because every number I put on the screen that you're about to see should be taken seriously. So Gartner's numbers here for you to see, but MIT Project MANDA that I just covered says that this is research. This is a research initiative out of the Media Lab looking at generative AI in enterprise settings. Their findings were that 95% of generative AI deployment showed zero measurable impact on profit and loss. Not negative, but not catastrophic, right? Just nothing. The business didn't even move. McKinsey Global AI Survey from 2026, 73% of enterprise AI deployments were failing to achieve their projected return on investment. That's what McKinsey was noting by saying that people are not anti-AI. They're in the business of selling AI transformation engagements. And even they are publishing that almost 3/4 of these projects don't hit the numbers. And then the headline number, right? AI governance today, tracking $665 billion in enterprise AI spending in recent cycles, with the majority of that underperforming. $665 billion, and the majority not delivering. Now, put those numbers next to the narrative that says your job is disappearing because AI is taking over enterprise operations. If AI is or was actually reorganizing enterprise operations, you'd see it on the profit and loss statement. You'd see it in the headcount decisions driven by measurable efficiency gains, not by a narrative cover. We're going to come back to that last part. Only 12% of organizations have data quality that would be considered capable of supporting AI applications, according to Gartner. Stat 2 here on the screen says that 60% of AI projects will be abandoned through 2026 due to data quality issues. Gartner has two numbers that I think are the most important in this entire conversation, more important than job cut headlines. These two numbers explain why the other numbers look the way they do. First, only 12% of organizations have data quality capable of actually supporting AI applications, not 50%, not 30%, 12. So what you hear that a company, or when you hear a company has deployed AI, ask yourself, are they in that 12%? Because if they're not, the model is running on dirty data and all the outputs are virtually meaningless or too expensive, and the project will fail on its own terms. Second, Gartner forecasts that 60% of AI projects will be abandoned through 2026 due to the data quality issues. Not because the models are bad, not because the technology doesn't work, but because the inputs are continually broken. This is what I spend my actual work doing, right? As a security expert and a data expert, I go into organizations, I work in my professional life day and day, and the first thing I do is look at data, not the model, the data. And it almost universally, the data is not ready. Governance is incomplete. Lineage is undefined. There's no single source of truth for entities where the business runs these continual processes, but is evolving slowly. You cannot put a generative AI layer on top of that and expect anything other than an expensive demo. The technology narrative skips that step entirely. It assumes the data is already ready for 88% of organizations, and it is not, right? So, no, this is not a credibility storm and no external citations needed for this, right? Let me step out of the research for a second here, give you my personal opinion, and tell you what I'm actually seeing. I work inside federal organizations, private businesses. I work with enterprises trying to figure out their data strategy. I do that in a couple of different roles, but what I am not seeing or not doing is evident as well through our conversations in these videos. So I'm operationally embedded. I see the actual systems, the actual pipelines, these actual organizational charts. And the number one thing I can tell you is that organizations that are succeeding with AI are not the ones that are deploying the most tools. They're the ones that did the boring work first. They clean their data. They establish governance. They define what a customer is, what a product is, what a transaction is in a way that every system in the company can agree on. And then, and only then, they started automating on top of that with a stable foundation, right? On the federal side, I can't go into specifics for obvious reasons, but I will tell you that the gap between the AI ambition and the data reality in government settings is larger than anything you've seen reported. Agencies are being sold and told to implement AI solutions. They're being asked to justify budgets around AI. And the underlying data infrastructure that any of this would depend on is in states of condition that would be charitably described as incomplete. Right. So when I hear someone say AI will eliminate federal workers or agencies that are going to be run by AI by 2030, I know what that data looks like inside those agencies, and the math doesn't work for me, right? Not because the models are capable, but because the foundations are just never there. They're not there now. This is not pessimism, I would say. This is just what it actually takes. Again, I want to stay on top of data quality for a minute because I think this is the most important structural blocker that is almost never included in the coverage about AI and jobs. I talked about how 85% of failed AI projects cite poor data quality as the root cause. Not model limitations, not compute costs, not talent shortages. The data was broken going in. So the project was broken going out. Think about what that means for the job displacement argument. If you want AI to actually replace a function, let's say accounts payable processing, let's say contract review or clinical documentation, you need the training data, the input data, the validation data, and all of it to be cleaned, labeled, governed, and representative of what the model is being asked to do. That work doesn't happen by itself. Somebody has to actually do it. In most organizations, nobody is doing it, or the people doing it are doing it inconsistently for whatever reason, right? They may be responsible for many different things, but if they are doing it and it's inconsistently, it's because it's in silos and it's without shared definitions or documentation that's readily accessible. The automation story assumes a world where the data is already prepared. In reality, you have to get the data to that state first, and this requires significant human expertise and labor, often more than the automation will eventually even save. I want to be really specific about one more thing here. Data quality is not just a technical problem, it's an organizational and political problem. Getting a company to agree on a single definition of customer or revenue across every business unit, every system, every team is a multi year engagement. I've done it. It requires human negotiators, not just data engineers. Models can't resolve the political fight between the sales team definition of a closed deal and the finance team's definition of a recognized revenue, right? So now let's talk about the job cuts that are happening because they are happening. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise. In quarter one, 2026, 27,000 jobs were cut where employers attributed that to AI. That number was up 40% year over year, and 32%, or I'm sorry, 32,000 tech sector losses in Q1 happened through Q2 of 2026. Those are real numbers, real people. And I don't want to be careful here because I don't want to minimize that. I'm sorry, I do certainly want to be careful because I don't want to minimize that. But here's the analytical questions that I would ask you to consider. Are these cuts happening because AI replaced the function? Are employers using AI as a narrative cover for something else? The San Francisco Standard did reporting on this in April 2026 and coined a term I think is exactly right: AI washing layoffs. What they found was that a significant number of companies attributing cuts to AI were companies that massively overhired during 2020 through 22 when remote work, zero interest rates, and pandemic era demand inflated their growth projections. They hired for a world that just couldn't sustain. And when the correction eventually came, when the interest rates went up, when the enterprise software spending has compressed, they needed to do right sizing. And that was always coming. AI is much more palatable as a narrative for that than we overhired. AI sounds inevitable. AI sounds like progress. We've hired too many people during COVID sounds like mismanagement. So when you see those job cut numbers, I want you to hold to two things simultaneously. Yes, some automation is real. Yes, some functions are being restructured, but the AI attribution in press releases is doing a lot more work than the underlying business decision that it does not support. One more data point before I get to the automation that actually works. Recent college graduate employment exceeded 9% in December 2025. That's not a typical labor market number for that demographic. That's a number that should cause real concern. And I want to tie this back to what Thiel said about credentials eroding. There is a specific segment of this population, people who just graduated with STEM degrees, who did everything they were told would get them into the knowledge economy, who are now being told simultaneously that job market is tight and that their skills are about to be obsolete away or obsoleted anyway. Think about the psychology of that message. If you believe your credentials are already losing value before you have even deployed, what are you likely to do? Maybe you're less likely to negotiate hard on a salary. Maybe you're more likely to accept contingent, gig based, or contractual work. Maybe more receptive to whatever alternative system a tech billionaire is proposing as the replacement for traditional employment. I'm not saying there's a meeting where that's being coordinated. I'm saying who benefits from a generation that believes their degree doesn't matter. The people selling that alternative, whoever controls the infrastructure of that replacement. That's the paradox. From here, I'll put up some demonstrations and some other evidence for you to understand in the PowerPoint presentation. If you want to go to Substack, check that out. I'll make sure that's available. But when automation is successful and sustainable inside an enterprise, the pattern that I've been able to observe is that function doesn't actually disappear. The labor just concentrates. You go from 15 people doing a task with varying quality and efficiency to 3 people doing it at a much higher volume with much higher consistency. Those 3 people need to understand the system in ways that the 15 did not. This is not the same thing as AI replaced those jobs. What it is a skills upgrade requirement, the middle skill version of the role, the one that requires showing up and executing a defined process without deep analytical ownership. That version compresses. The high skill version, the person who owns the system, validates the outputs, understands when the model is hallucinating or when the training data has drifted, handles the edge cases when the model breaks, that version expands. Deloitte ran a survey in 2026. 84% of companies have not redesigned roles around AI. 84%. So even in organizations that are deploying AI tools, most of them have not thought what it means for how the work gets structured. They've added a tool, they haven't done the organizational design work, which means the labor disruption isn't even in effect for most of those companies. So the timeline in which mass displacement might hypothetically occur is being delayed by the organization's own inability to reorganize around the tools that they bought. The people telling you work is over are not telling you about organizational friction. They're not telling you about change management. They are simply just not telling you about the political fights over role definitions because none of that makes for a compelling narrative, right? Let me be clear about who's actually at risk here because I don't want to sound like I'm saying everything is fine and that everything is not fine. What I'm really trying to concentrate on is that the people most at risk from AI enabled automation are not senior data engineers. They're not fractional CDOs. They're not the people in the audience who are already deep in technical stacks and working on the next AI project for their GitHub. The people whose jobs consist primarily of defined, repeatable, rules based tasks that require limited judgment and who do not have the financial runway to access retraining or the institutional support to upgrade their skill set on a compressed timeline. Those are the people most at risk. That includes a meaningful share of the administrative workforce. It includes a lot of the entry level roles in legal, finance, and customer service. It includes the pipeline roles that junior analysts used to occupy before they moved up to senior work. And the compression of those roles has become very real. What I object to in the tech bro narrative is not the observation that labor is changing. That's true. I object to the frame that this is inevitable, natural, and nobody's fault, and actually good if you just accept it. Because that frame is convenient for exactly the people who profit from you accepting it and not organizing around alternatives. The people who built these systems have the resources to absorb the transition. The people who don't and didn't just simply won't. And the solution being offered, token distribution, AI dividends, some form of future compute stake, assumes that people being displaced will have the financial literacy, the access, and the time to participate in an abstract system designed by the same people who displaced them. I find that worth examining on my own, but with you as well. Right. So here's where we land. The technology is real. Some of the disruption is real, and some of the roles will contract. I'm not telling you to ignore or pretend that this is not happening. What I'm telling you is that don't take the narrative from the people who profit from the narrative. Look at the incentive structure. Look at what they own. Look at what the data shows inside actual organizations. And look at the gap between the story being told in press releases and earnings calls, and the story being told by the numbers coming out of MIT, McKinsey, Gartner. 95% of deployments still showing zero profit and loss impact. 73% missing return on investments targets. 88% of organizations lacking the data quality to even support AI applications. 84% not even having redesigned roles. These are not anti-AI numbers. They're just the actual numbers. And when you stack these against 665 billion in spending in a narrative that says the work is fundamentally over, that's a gap. And inside the gap is where the funded ideology, as I call it, has lived. Now, tell me where I'm wrong, right? Genuinely, because this is a paradox, not a verdict. If you're inside an organization where you've seen measurable labor displacement tied directly to an AI deployment, with the receipts, with the before and after headcount or the productivity numbers, I would love to hear it, right? Drop a comment, go to link in my bio, connect with me on Twitter, Blue Sky, TikTok, wherever you think you'd like to have the discussion. And if you think I've misread Andreessen, Altman, or Thiel, link me the quotes. I will address them. If you're a recent college grad trying to figure out what to actually do with your career in this environment, leave a comment with your background and what you're trying to build. This might be the beginning of that next episode. And then subscribe to the Refinery Paradox on Substack if this is the kind of conversation you want more of. That's obviously the platform where I get to provide more on the topics and be a little bit more transparent in what we're talking about. Right. Again, I am the AI guy, Atlanta, or Ernest Provo, and this has been a review of the paradox and how it's affecting today. Until next time, see y'all around.